I feel like I am one of your students, that you have been my teacher as I have read through the years what you have written. It's my pleasure to have met you for the first time tonight, but you've been known to me in that way for a long time. And so it's really my pleasure to ask you to talk to us this evening about your own journey and where we are in the separation of church and state.
Thank you for that, Alan. Thanks to all of you for coming out. I do appreciate it. Looking at those photos earlier that were on the screen, it was a little sobering. A lot of time has passed, and I sometimes wonder what happened. It seems like it was not that long ago that it was November 16th, 1987, which was my first day at Americans United for Separation of Church and State. And I remember it so well. I was hired to be the assistant editor of Church and State magazine, which is our monthly journal. And my first day, my boss, who was a guy named Joe Kahn, walked into my office and he put this huge manila folder full of newspaper clippings on my desk. And I said, what are these? And he said, well, you're going to write this part of the magazine. For those of you who know Church and State know in the back of the magazine, we have these short stories. They're like news briefs. People, News, and Events, it's called now, but back then it was simply People and Events, or as we called it, the P&E. And he said, you get to write the P&E. That's your first assignment. And, this is a pre-internet age, so it basically was pulled together from newspaper clippings people had sent us all around the country. And I would summarize those and then later, of course, wrote full-length articles, but that was my first day, and I just remember it so well because it was so interesting. I mean, just sort of diving right in there and producing for the magazine. At that time, I was also the assistant director of communications, so I would help out with our media relations and line up media interviews for Barry Lynn. Some of you may remember. Barry came to us actually in 1992, but in 1987, when I started, there was a gentleman named Bob Maddox who was running the organization. So I would help out and get the media put together there. And it's been a remarkable journey. And the great thing about Americans United, for me, has been that they gave me amazing opportunities to write, to travel, to come to places like this, to meet wonderful people like you working on these issues locally, to cover church-state cases at the U.S. Supreme Court. I mean, I was 25 years old, and I still remember the sense of awe I felt the first time I approached that building, the U.S. Supreme Court in Washington, D.C., and to go in there and sit in the press gallery and watch these cases that literally make history. To be one of the few to sit there and do that, to cover that, is quite remarkable. In later years, I did things like slipped into meetings of the Christian Coalition and the Family Research Council, kind of sitting in the back and not drawing any attention to myself as I would write articles about the things that they were doing and the ways they were trying to change our country. Americans United encouraged me to be on cable news programs, on CNN, MSNBC, and even Fox News. And every time I did Fox News, especially after email was invented, you'd get this torrent of hate mail. You just got used to that. It's something that they would do. But I remember this one guy especially sent me a message after I was on Fox News, and of course he didn't like what I had to say. And he ended it with, "Get a better toupee." And I was really kind of annoyed because I've always been proud of my hair, And it's 100% real. And I'm thinking, dude, what were you watching? Get a better toupee. Anyway, one of the best parts of the job has been coming to places like this, talking to people locally, trying to help as you do incredibly hard work in this state. And I know Texas is challenging. Believe me, I understand that. But you've persevered. You've stayed at it. And that has been much to our benefit at the National Office of Americans United to have folks like you here locally working on these things. Because, you know, a lot of times local lawmakers, they really don't want to hear from somebody in Washington, D.C., but they do want to hear from you, constituents, people who live in this state. So that helps us to have that local presence. I want to spend a little time talking about some of the specific challenges we face right now. And they are many. I don't think that's a surprise to any of you in this room. This is a very, very difficult time for separation of church and state. And I'm not happy to be stepping away, as I will at the end of the year, at a time when things are so bad. But to be honest, they're not going to get any better anytime soon. I hope they will someday, but it's going to be pretty rocky for the next few years. Tax funding of religious institutions. That is an issue that has been central to the work of Americans United from day one. And here we have lost, unfortunately, a lot of ground. We are at a point where the Supreme Court is actually saying not only is it permitted for the government to use tax money for private religious schools, not only is it permitted, in some cases, it is required. Now, we had a recent case at the Supreme Court that some of you might have heard about in Oklahoma. They tried to create the nation's first religious public charter school. Now, it's just the very phrase makes my head want to explode. Religious public charter school. It would have been unthinkable 15 or 20 years ago that such a thing could even be proposed. Here we had it set up and ready to go. There was litigation. The Attorney General of Oklahoma is actually, although a Republican, is actually concerned about this, so he filed litigation to stop it. Americans United filed litigation to stop it. The Oklahoma Supreme Court said, no, you can't do this. But then it got appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court, and the U.S. Supreme Court deadlocked 4-4 because Amy Coney Barrett had recused herself from that case. So the result was good. When the Supreme Court deadlocks, that means the lower court opinion stands, and the Oklahoma Supreme Court's opinion stands. St. Isidore, this so-called religious public charter school, cannot operate. But, you know, it's probably only a matter of time before they come back and bring another challenge like this, one where Amy Coney Barrett won't have to recuse herself. So we got a little bit of a breather there, but I don't think we've seen the last of that issue. Right now in Washington, D.C., you might have read about this. There's been a big debate over what Trump calls the big, beautiful bill, which is actually big, certainly not beautiful. It's kind of ugly, actually. It's got a lot of stuff in it that's very alarming, including a $5 billion private school voucher plan. $5 billion. That's with a B. What they're trying to pass in Washington, D.C. right now. So when it comes to the tax funding of religion, we're really under the gun on this. The erosion of secular public education continues, too. You might remember the case from a few years ago involving the coach in Washington State, Joe Kennedy, who was praying with students at the 50-yard line. And the school said, you know, you're really not supposed to pray with students. You're an authority figure, you're on the staff here. They offered to let him pray privately and find a place for him. They were willing to accommodate him. But of course, he didn't want that. He wanted to make a big show out of his prayers, and he wanted to pray with the students. So he got a group, one of these aggressive Christian nationalist legal groups, and sued. And Americans United in that case defended the school. We knew we were going to lose. We knew that was going to be a challenging case. But we tried, and I think successfully, to keep the damage from being too bad. So that case was a loss, but it could have been a lot worse. We have situations right now where the government is allowed to display religious symbols on public land that we all own. Some of you might be familiar with a case from a few years ago where there was a large cross in Bladensburg, Maryland, alleged to be a war memorial. It's a cross. A cross is not a war memorial. A cross only memorializes Christians. Doesn't memorialize anybody else. But the Supreme Court allowed this to stand because it had been there a long time. So now we have constitutional violations being grandfathered in. If they've been around long enough, it's acceptable. This is the reasoning of the Supreme Court. And of course, we have some battles over something you might be familiar with here in Texas, and that is the display of the Ten Commandments in public schools and other public institutions. Now, I want to spend a little bit of time on this because it keeps popping up. It has been mentioned that we're already suing over this matter in Louisiana. Arkansas has also passed a law like this. And of course, it's just a matter of time before they do so here in Texas. Now, the thing is, we've been through this before. The precedent is clear. In 1980, in a case called Stone v. Graham, the Supreme Court struck down the display of the Ten Commandments in public schools in Kentucky. But of course, Christian nationalist organizations right now feel that the Supreme Court is willing to change a lot of the precedent, and sadly, they may be right. The Supreme Court is changing a lot of the church-state precedent. So you have these new challenges being brought forth. But I just want to step back a little bit here when it comes to the Ten Commandments and do a little bit of a deeper dive, because we just keep having this issue come up. And it's predicated on a lie, that the Ten Commandments played some sort of foundational role in the development of our government or our nation, and that simply is not the case. Now, think about this for a moment. Most of the Ten Commandments are not illegal under secular law. You don't have to worship one God. You are allowed to make idols. You're allowed to take the Lord's name in vain. You don't have to honor the Sabbath. You're not required to honor your parents. Adultery is no longer illegal. And coveting, far from being illegal, coveting, I would argue, is kind of the basis of our entire economy. Now, 3 of the commandments do ban murder, lying, and theft. But you know what? These things are illegal, and they've always been illegal. And every society, every philosophical system condemns these actions because they are corrosive to societies. And societies can't exist if people are engaging in these behaviors. The Ten Commandments are not the basis of American law. Now, the Christian nationalists will say differently, and they say that all the time, but they are simply wrong. Some of you might remember back in the early 2000s when Americans United and the ACLU sued Roy Moore in Alabama. You remember that case? He was the Chief Justice of the Alabama Supreme Court, brought this 2-ton Ten Commandments monument into the courthouse, and we sued him. And he continued to argue this was the basis of the law. Well, a bunch of legal scholars and historians came together at that time to file a brief in the federal courts just to address this issue head on. Here's what they said in part. Aside from a failed attempt in the 17th century to establish a biblically based legal system in the Puritan colonies, American law is generally viewed as having secular origins. And then they talked about those secular origins. American law evolved from English common and statutory law, ancient Roman law, the civil law of continental Europe, and private international law. Other influences included writings and thinkers like William Blackstone, John Locke, Adam Smith, and others, and the Federalist Papers. Now, Christian nationalists will sometimes make really interesting arguments about American law. I once heard someone say at a Christian nationalist meeting with a straight face that the 3 branches of government are based on the Trinity. In fact, the 3 branches of government come primarily from the writings of the French philosopher Baron de Montesquieu, 1689-1755, as outlined in his book, The Spirit of the Laws. Montesquieu, in turn, is believed to have borrowed the idea in part from the theory of mixed government that was common at the time of the ancient Roman Republic. Now, obviously, Montesquieu refined the concept, and our founders refined it even further. Now, I have an idea. If you want to post 10 of something in the public schools, how about the Bill of Rights? There's 10 of them, and they actually do have some implication for our laws. So let's talk about hanging that 10. Other problems we face right now. The warping of the very definition of religious freedom and what it means. The Supreme Court embracing this theory that religious freedom gives you the right to discriminate against others or to ignore secular laws that you don't happen to like. We're seeing waves of book censorship in this country, both in public schools and public libraries. Groups like Moms for Liberty running amok, attacking books that Christian nationalists don't like, mainly books that might have something to do with LGBTQ rights or certain inconvenient facets of our history that they would rather not be taught. like the years and years of institutionalized racism and the suppression of women that have marked so much of our history. We see bills attacking members of the LGBTQ+ community, especially those in the transgender community. We see the Supreme Court, as I mentioned a moment ago, scrapping decades of legal precedent, blithely tossing out tests that they had used and replacing them with, they claim, a new test that supposedly is anchored in history and tradition. But the only problem with this test is that the court continues to ignore history and doesn't honor tradition. We are not and never have been an officially Christian nation. To say that we are is bad history. And our tradition, which the court fails to recognize, is one of separation of church and state. There are days when I really have to fight great sadness when I realize that a lot of where we are right now came about because of Donald Trump, a biblically illiterate, amoral, bloviating narcissist. This is the man who trashed the separation of church and state. Now, I used to worry about, like, a real religious fanatic, like a Pat Robertson type, getting elected to the presidency and ushering in this type of Handmaid's Tale type society, a dark theocracy. And now as we start inching toward that, the person who brought this about, I don't even know how many times he's been married. I can't keep track. Convicted, accused rapist. This is the hero of Christian nationalism. This is their champion. And I have to remember that he didn't do this alone, of course. There was a lot of money behind him and a lot of powerful organizations that wanted to change this country. Still, it is a bitter pill to swallow, to see 38 years of work, things I had advocated for, come crashing down in a matter of a few years because of a guy who used to sell meat on television. So, one of the things I find useful for us to do, and have over my 38 years with Americans United, is to take a look back at some of our history because it is instructive. It is important. Because I've always believed we really can't understand where we are today if we don't know how we got here, where we have been, what brought us to this point. And when I say what brought us to this point, I don't necessarily mean all the bad stuff that's happening now. I mean the point of this country being one founded for religious freedom with a separation of church and state. I mean, that isn't just something that happened. That was planned. There was a reason we have a separation of church and state. It's because we had so many bad experiences when we did not have it. People being persecuted, imprisoned, fined, jailed, even killed because of their beliefs. In the 17th century, Roger Williams, founder of Rhode Island, spoke of the importance of what he called soul liberty, the right of conscience to decide what religion, if any, you would affiliate with. Now, Roger Williams was a Puritan minister, later a Baptist, later, well, nobody's really sure what he ended up as, but he was a believer, devout, very serious Christian. Yet he once said, "Forced religion stinks in God's nostrils." Roger Williams believed very strongly that the state should have no business trying to tell you how to worship, where to worship, when to worship, who to worship with, or whether you even should worship. That's a matter between you and God or conscience, however you want to put that. He spoke of the need for separation between, quote, the garden of the church and the wilderness of the world. That metaphor of separation, division, gaps, barriers, later resurfaced in the thinking of Thomas Jefferson. Speaking of Thomas Jefferson, he wrote something very important in 1776, the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom. The Virginia Statute did two things. It disestablished the Anglican Church as the official church in Virginia, and it guaranteed to everyone the right to worship as they saw fit, as guided by conscience. Two key concepts: no official religion, complete religious freedom for everybody. Jefferson's statute was written in 1776, but we had some other things on our minds back then, and it didn't become law until 1786. Jefferson, reflecting on that law, made it clear that it was meant, as he put it, to comprehend, quote, within the mantle of its protection, the Jew and the Gentile, the Christian and the Mohammedan, the Hindu and the infidel of every denomination. The reason I point that out is because there are people who argue, oh, it's only Christianity. You know, our founders really, they supported religious freedom as long as you were Christian. No, nonsense. From the writings of the founders themselves, we can see that they viewed religious freedom as a very expansive thing. The Jew and the Gentile, the Christian and the Mohammedan, the Hindu, the infidel of every denomination. Even the infidels are being protected. Okay, this is a broad vision of religious freedom, and it had an impact on our First Amendment. Those concepts that Jefferson put in that bill, no official church, religious freedom for everybody. Where else do you see that? The First Amendment, which says basically the same thing. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. James Madison, a protege and friend of Thomas Jefferson, helped write the First Amendment. Indeed, he's the father of the Constitution. He wrote much of that document. His experience in Virginia, pushing Jefferson's bill through the legislature, making it law, had a deep impact on our First Amendment as well. Now, why would the founders have been so concerned about this? Why would the founders have wanted this version of religious freedom with a separation of church and state to protect it? Because they knew what happened when you don't have that system. They were keen students of history, and they knew that in Europe there had been hundreds of years of violence, bloodshed, war, torture, death, and terror because religious groups tried to tell people how they should relate to God. Hundreds of years of religious groups at one another's throats. Religious groups aligned with the power of the state. Some might say drunk on the power of the state, persecuting others, lifting up the sword, striking down the infidels. And they didn't have to go all the way to Europe to see it. In our own colonies, there have been examples of religious intolerance. People being persecuted for faith and what they believed or what they did not believe. So, if you think about the Christian nation idea, it is debunked by the very words of our Constitution. And it isn't just the First Amendment. At the end of Article 6, there's an interesting provision that says that there shall be no religious test for public office. Now, by religious test, they didn't mean a pop quiz. They meant there's going to be no religious qualification for public office. You don't have to be a Christian. You don't have to be a Protestant. You don't have to believe in the Trinity to hold public office under the United States. Why'd they put that in there? Because in some states, in some colonies, you did have to believe those things. The laws restricted public office to certain types of believers or excluded people based on what they believed or did not believe. Founders wanted none of that at the federal level. Some years after the passage of the First Amendment, Thomas Jefferson, reflecting on that document, wrote his famous letter to the Danbury Baptist on January 1st, 1802, in which he invoked that metaphor of the First Amendment erecting a wall of separation between church and state. The Danbury Baptists in Connecticut who wrote to Jefferson were being persecuted at the time. They lived in a state where Congregationalism was the official church of Connecticut. And the Baptists wanted their rights. They wanted no more established church, no more official religion. They knew Jefferson was a champion of this cause, and they wrote to him with their concerns, and he agreed that there should be no official religion. That wall of separation, an important metaphor that the Supreme Court actually embraced for a number of years and endorsed and spoke favorably of, but does not do that anymore. So that's some actual history. And what the Christian nationalists are offering us isn't history at all. It is something else. Their views actually spring from the late 19th century when there were efforts to amend our Constitution to add explicit references to Christianity, Jesus, in God in that document. Remember, the Constitution, as written, doesn't contain any of that religious language. There's no mention of Christ, no mention of Jesus, no mention of Christianity, no mention of God. It is a wholly secular document. And it's that way for a reason. Some pastors in the 19th century, after the Civil War, felt that that was a mistake. The framers had made a mistake, and they wanted to add this religious language to the Constitution. Now, they failed, but that's really the genesis of Christian nationalism. It certainly isn't something that goes back to our founding period. It is really more of a late 19th century artifact, and now we simply have Christian nationalists arguing that it's a vision embraced by the founders when clearly it was not. And while I would point out that these visions are contrasting visions, they are not equal visions because one of them is wrong. The Christian nationalist view. It's no historical support. Sometimes when people ask me, what's the best answer to Christian nationalism when they make these claims about the Christian nation? And I say, okay, say to them, that's interesting. Where is that in our Constitution? Where does it say we're an officially Christian nation? Where does it say that Jesus is, the King of Kings? Where does it say anything about the Christian faith in our Constitution? And it simply isn't in there. So they don't have an argument there. That's a little history. Where are we now? Well, not a very good place. I think I've made that clear. We are at a strange place because, actually, if you look at some polling data, things ought to be better than they are. I mean, people generally are supportive of separation of church and state. We did a poll at Americans United in 2019, and we found that 60%, 60% of the respondents said that protecting separation of church and state was either one of the most important things to them personally or the most important. Only 9% said it wasn't too important to them. Furthermore, 47% said that a candidate's announcing support for separation of church and state made them more likely as voters to back that candidate. And only 11% said that if a candidate embraced separation of church and state, that they wouldn't want to vote for that candidate. So, the support's there. And if you look at some of the polling data on questions like legal abortion, access to legal abortion, censorship of books, the rights of LGBTQ Americans, the support is generally good. It's on our side. Yet, here we are. So how do we get here? How do we get to this place? How do we get to a point where Christian nationalists working hand in glove with the White House are laying waste to so much of what we care about? Well, this may sound a little harsh, some of what I'm about to say, but part of the problem is that people don't care enough about democracy in this country. They're throwing honored democratic traditional principles under the bus because they're promised cheaper eggs. People not caring enough about these basic democratic principles. That's a real problem. People denying reality. Certain segment of our population has decided that no matter what facts you present to them, they don't care. They're going to believe what they want to believe. So they will believe things like the United States was founded to be a Christian nation, even though there's no evidence. They will reject the idea that the earth is ancient. They won't accept that all people deserve basic rights and that all religious and non-religious views should be equal. There's an ongoing attack on objective truth out there, and we see how that manifested itself in the wake of the January 6th attacks, where people have basically rewritten the script there. Even though we have video that shows what happened that day, there are still people arguing with a straight face that it was just a friendly visit. We have various conspiracy theories. QAnon's still out there. This leaves us vulnerable to these extremist viewpoints. A lack of critical thinking. This is not a new problem. It's been something that's going on in our country for a long time, but it certainly seems to have accelerated in this internet age. And of course, there are other factors too. Some people have simply they've lost interest in politics. There are voter suppression laws in some states that have made it hard for some people to get out and vote. Some people have unrealistic expectations for political candidates and get angry if they're not in agreement with them 100%. They won't support them, even though they then end up with a candidate who gives them absolutely nothing. And of course, we have massive amounts being poured into disinformation campaigns and bad information circulating via social media. And of course, it is the nature of our system in a two-party democracy. Even in a close election, the winner takes all. We have an alliance of the secular right, anti-tax, anti-regulation, forging coalitions with Christian nationalists, fanning the politics of resentment, anti-women, anti-black, anti-trans, whoever the enemy du jour is, getting people worked up about that. A confluence of events that set the stage for disaster, the perfect storm that brought us to this unfortunate place. Now, here comes the hard part. What can be done? As I go around the country speaking, I was just in Grand Junction, Colorado a few weeks ago, and we had a good turnout for an event there sponsored by a group called Restore the Balance, which is working to fight political extremism. But I found the people there to be very hungry for things to do. It kept coming up. What can we do? What can we do? And I understand that. I feel that too. And I'm not going to tell you that I've got a really easy answer to this, but I have some ideas I want to share with you. And one is that at Americans United, anyway, we're understanding the current challenges of the legal moment right now, and we're trying to be strategic in how we bring our litigation. It's been mentioned that we may be suing, we'll be suing here in Texas, already suing against the Ten Commandments in Louisiana and some other places. But even when we're not suing, we still get forced into court sometimes in ways that we would rather not. The case involving the coach in Washington State is a good example. The school was sued by an aggressive Christian nationalist legal organization on behalf of that coach. And we believed that that school deserved a defense. So we came in and defended the school, even though we knew we weren't going to win. We did the best job we could, as I said, tried to contain the damage. My point is that sometimes people say, well, look, just stop going into court. The atmosphere is too bad in court. Just don't do it anymore. It's not that simple. Because the aggressive Christian nationalist legal organizations know they have the legal wind at their back, so they're now filing lawsuits. Somebody has to defend those lawsuits. Somebody has to answer those lawsuits. Somebody has to go into court and at least try to stop what they're doing. And that's some of what we've been doing at Americans United. So we're going to be in court sometimes, even we'd rather not be. Political mobilization, obviously, is part of the answer here. Now, Americans United is a 501c3 organization. We're not allowed to endorse candidates or political parties. We don't do that. But there are plenty of other organizations out there that do that type of work. And I would urge you to be involved in those. Obviously, better candidates, better views is part of the solution. And I mean that from the local school board all the way up to federal office. We need to be cultivating new leaders. And that's something we've been working at a lot at Americans United. It's been on my mind, especially as I contemplate retiring at the end of the year. One of the reasons I feel that I can do that is because we have this body of young activists who are ready to step in and continue the work, a new generation of leaders. I mean, I really hope I live long enough to see things start to turn around again, the pendulum come back. But if I don't, I think I will have laid some important groundwork, and other folks at Americans United will have laid some important groundwork that this next generation of activists can pick up and finish this work and get us back to a proper understanding of separation of church and state. And we have to recognize the long-term nature of this struggle. This is not something that we're going to turn around in a matter of a couple years. It's going to take some time. We did not lose some of these core rights overnight, and it's going to take a long time to get them back. Think about legal abortion. The other side worked on that for 49 years. And as much as I deplore what they did, I kind of have to tip my hat to their tenacity. They just kept coming back. A court would strike down a law, they would rewrite it, get another one passed. They didn't go away. And it's unfortunate what they were able to do there, but we need maybe to think about that too. The long-term nature of the struggle, keep fighting it. We need to keep educating people as much as we can. I mentioned earlier this idea that objective reality, objective truth is under attack. There are still some people for whom facts matter. And if we can reach those audiences and continue to get those facts out, that will help to some extent. We need a local focus. School boards are especially important, the bodies that may govern your local libraries, other types of local boards. There actually has been some movement in this area that is optimistic, it's positive. This group, Moms for Liberty, that I mentioned a moment ago, that's been running around trying to censor books and attack LGBTQ books and so on. They have been pushed out of some school districts where they got majorities on the board because voters got activated and removed them from the board. In Pennsylvania and other states, we've seen Florida, we've seen examples of that. So when people get activated at the local level, we can still make a difference. And so I would urge you to always be aware of what's happening in your local communities, city councils, town councils, school boards especially. Sometimes these get overlooked and they need to be important. It's important you keep looking at those. The last thing I want to say about this is I'm not a psychologist, but I do know that these are very difficult and challenging times for all of us. So I would urge you to be involved in self-care and well-being. And what I mean by that is get balance in your life. Don't doom scroll. That's not doing you any good. I have a practice where at the end of the day, instead of looking at my phone and reading headlines and getting agitated, I read a book that has nothing to do with politics. Maybe a novel, maybe a history book, whatever I'm interested in reading at the time. And then I start to fall asleep. You know how you're reading and you start reading the same line over like 5 times? Your head's nodding? That's a sign. Turn off the light and drift away. If as I learned from bitter experience during the election, if I was up late looking at my phone and reading headlines and following things obsessively, that was not a recipe for a restful night. And the reason I say this is because I want you to be ready to be involved and to be active and prepared for these battles. And if you're constantly agitated or you haven't had a good night's sleep, you can't do that. So, take a break, have an inner life, have other interests. A little less social media, I found that's very helpful for me too. I've been stepping away from a lot of that, and I just feel that my life is better. So you energize yourself for the fights that come. Now, despite what I have said, kind of the gloom maybe that I put on this speech, I am optimistic that we will return to a proper understanding of separation of church and state in this country. And the reason is, we have to. Other ways of relating church and state are not going to work for us as a country. The America that the Supreme Court is trying to foist on us doesn't work. This nation is more diverse than ever. Currently, only about 60% of Americans say they are Christian, which is a huge drop from, say, even like the 1990s. People are engaging in kind of a do-it-yourself spirituality, mixing traditions, blending faiths, experimenting with non-Christian religions. And what the court is trying to do is, I think, a slap in the face to that spirit and a slap in the face to our history that it can't stand. It will not stand. It must not stand. It doesn't work for America. On July 10th, 1822, James Madison wrote the following to a friend of his named Edward Livingston, quote, "We are teaching the world the great truth, that governments do better without kings and nobles than with them. The merit will be doubled by the other lesson, that religion flourishes in greater purity without, rather than with, the aid of government." Think about that. We are teaching the world. What an interesting way to put that. See, Madison knew that we had done something really interesting, something bold, something audacious with the First Amendment. And it was so powerful and so important and so wonderful that it was worth sharing with the world. So they wanted to show the world there was a better way to organize government. Monarchs with absolute power who claimed to rule by divine right were no longer needed. There was a better way. Representative democracy, even with all of its faults and limitations and the fact that it wasn't truly representative in our country for a long time, was better than monarchy. And, as Madison observed, they wanted to teach the world that there was a better way to order the relationship between religion and government. Many nations in Europe, of course, had officially established churches, and as I mentioned, that had spawned so many centuries of oppression and terror. There was a better way, our founders said. Separation between the institutions of religion and government. So we are teaching the world, said Madison. I sometimes wonder to myself, what are we teaching the world today? The facts mean nothing, that they can be stretched like silly putty. The reality is whatever a strong man says it is. That you don't have to believe evidence even if you've seen it with your own eyes. That the powerful, the majority, will assume more rights by mere dint of their numbers. That some Americans are less than. We can do better. We must do better. We will do better. The good news is that Americans United is well positioned to meet this moment. Much has changed since I was a young man in 1987. Our staff now stands at 50 people in Washington and all over the nation because we're fully remote, so we have people working all over the country for us now. AU's budget is larger than it has ever been in all the time I've been with Americans United. Rachel Lazar, our president and CEO, is a visionary who understands the need for Americans United to think ahead and engage in long-range planning. So we're in this for the long haul. And you have been in this for the long haul too, here in Houston. And your 30th anniversary is cause for celebration. And I am honored that you asked me to be here with you 30 years later when I was here way back in 1995. And I know how challenging it can be for you here in Texas to advocate for separation of church and state. Texas is difficult. You know, I sometimes think when I see something really strange happening in a place like Florida or Louisiana, I think, or Oklahoma, what's Texas waiting for? or if these states are in some type of competition to see which one can come up with the most offensive laws. And sadly enough, that does sometimes seem to be the case. It's like, you know, Louisiana passes something and Oklahoma gets FOMO, and then Texas gets in on the things. And so I know it's not been easy here. But you've kept at it. And that means a lot to us at the national office. Because advocating for this cause, as difficult as it may be right now, as challenging as it may be, as frustrating as it may be, I want to be clear to you, it is never a burden. It is an honor and it is a privilege to stand for the separation of church and state, as you have done. And although I may be retiring, I won't be disengaging because, well, I'm too opinionated for that. I'm going to find ways to stay involved. I've already been talking to Rachel about that, so you haven't seen the last of me. But I will admit that this is very challenging. As I mentioned a moment ago, to kind of see so much of this work collapse so quickly, and to know that a lot of this was the work of scheming billionaires and their propaganda machines that just overwhelmed people 24/7 with this information to the point where they simply couldn't stand against the onslaught. So we have serious challenges in the months and years ahead. But when I get discouraged, I go back to what Madison said. We are teaching the world. You know, I still want us to teach the world. And one of the things I want us to continue teaching the world is that you need to separate religion and government. Because, after all, history and the world today show us what happens when you don't. Devitalized state churches, such as you still find in some European nations, are one example. The other is nightmarish theocracies, such as we see in some parts of the Islamic world. In no case do you find freedom in those countries that fail to separate religion and government. In no case do you find more rights. In no case do you find people being lifted up. You only find oppression. So yes, we are teaching the world, and let's keep doing that. but we need to do a better job maybe teaching ourselves as well. And perhaps things didn't work out exactly the way I would have liked, but I am proud that I dedicated my career to Americans United. I have enjoyed traveling around the country, meeting people like you, speaking at events like this. I had a good time sparring with Christian nationalists on cable news, even if they didn't like my hair. I was always writing something for Americans United, whether it was a blog post, a magazine article, whatever. I wanted to be a writer, and I've managed to make a living with my pen. So I'm pleased about that. And Americans United gave me so many amazing opportunities, as I mentioned a moment ago, to travel, to try new things, to grow my position. And I am keenly aware that it was the support of people like you in this room who have made that possible with your donations, both financial and moral, so thank you for that. But, my friends, we are not done yet. There is so much more to do. I thank you for the support you've given Americans United and to me during this journey, which has been amazing. But I am aware there are still stories to tell, still things to teach the world, battles to fight, and a great principle to contend for. We have that honor. Thank you.